May 26, 1960. The United Nations Security Council, New York. The air in the chamber was thick enough to choke on. The Cold War had reached a boiling point that threatened to spill over into nuclear annihilation. Just weeks earlier, the Soviets had shot down an American U-2 spy plane and captured its pilot, Francis Gary Powers, exposing the United States' secret aerial surveillance program to the world. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev was demanding an apology, pounding his fists, humiliating the Eisenhower administration on the global stage. The American delegation, led by Ambassador Henry Cabot Lodge, Jr., appeared cornered, caught red-handed in the act of espionage. But Lodge had brought something with him to the chamber that day, something hidden beneath a cloth on the table before him, an object that would flip the narrative of moral superiority on its head. With the eyes of the world's press fixed upon him, Lodge stood up. He didn't speak of planes or pilots. Instead, he reached down and unveiled a large, beautifully carved wooden replica of the Great Seal of the United States. It was a magnificent piece of craftsmanship, the bald eagle proud and defiant, the shield polished to a shine. But Lodge wasn't there to discuss art. With a dramatic gesture that would be replayed on newsreels for decades, he used a pair of tweezers to point out a tiny hole in the eagle's beak, barely visible to the naked eye. He then rotated the heavy seal to reveal the back, which had been split open to expose a small silver cylinder nested in the hollowed-out wood. "This," Lodge declared, his voice echoing through the silent chamber, "is a listening mechanism." It was inside the Great Seal of the United States, hanging on the wall of the ambassador's study in Moscow, right behind his desk. The room erupted. The Soviets sat stone-faced, but the message was clear. While they were condemning American spy planes in the sky, they had spent years listening to every whisper, every rustle of paper, every private strategy session in the heart of the American embassy in Moscow. The device Lodge held up was unlike anything Western intelligence had ever seen. It had no batteries. It had no wires. It had no power source. It was a ghost machine, a technological impossibility that had functioned perfectly for 7 years right under the noses of the best technical security sweepers in the world. This is the story of that device, of the genius prisoner who built it, and of the most successful Trojan horse in the history of espionage. To understand how the United States ambassador came to hang a Soviet listening device on his own wall, we have to rewind 15 years, to a moment when the world was drunk on the euphoria of victory. February 9, 1945. The Crimea Conference at Yalta was underway. Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin were carving up the post-war world, and the spirit of alliance, though fraying, was still intact. In this atmosphere of diplomatic camaraderie, the Soviet Union extended an invitation to the U.S. Ambassador, W. Averell Harriman, to visit the Artek Young Pioneer Camp on the Black Sea coast. Artek was the crown jewel of the Soviet youth movement, a pristine sanitary camp for the elite children of the party. The invitation was a masterstroke of psychological profiling. The NKVD, the predecessor to the KGB, knew Harriman well. They knew he was a wealthy railroad heir, a man of refined tastes, but also a man who desperately wanted to believe in the possibility of sustained cooperation between the two superpowers. They knew that a direct gift from Stalin might be viewed with suspicion, but a gift from children? That was a different kind of weapon. The Soviets prepared a ceremony of overwhelming innocence. Hundreds of children in crisp white shirts and red neckerchiefs sang American folk songs in perfect English. They raised the Star-Spangled Banner alongside the hammer and sickle. It was a display of friendship so disarming that it lowered the guard of every American diplomat present. At the climax of the ceremony, a choir of children approached Ambassador Harriman carrying a large, heavy object draped in velvet. When they revealed it, the Americans gasped. It was a massive wooden plaque, 2 feet in diameter, carving the Great Seal of the United States in exquisite detail. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. It was made from the finest woods the Soviet Union had to offer: sandalwood, boxwood, redwood, ivory palm, and Persian walnut. The eagle's feathers were individually rendered with a precision that bordered on the obsessive. It was a gesture of respect, a symbol of the sovereignty of the United States, hand-carved by the innocent youth of Russia. Harriman was visibly moved. He asked his translator to thank the children profusely. But the ambassador wasn't a fool. He was a veteran diplomat in a hostile country. Before the plaque left the camp, the embassy's security protocols kicked in. The logic of 1945 surveillance was based on active electronics. A bug needed a power source. It needed a battery to run the microphone and the transmitter, or it needed a wire running through the wall to a power main. Batteries were bulky and had short lives. Wires were detectable with metal detectors or physical inspection. When the seal arrived back at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow, specifically at the Spaso House, the ambassador's opulent residence, it was subjected to a thorough technical sweep. Technicians ran their hands over the smooth wood. They checked for hidden compartments that might hold a battery pack. They scanned it with the crude metal detectors of the era. They found nothing. No wires, no batteries, no humming transformers. Just wood and glue. Satisfied that it was merely a beautiful piece of art, Harriman made a decision that the NKVD had banked on. He hung it in the most prestigious spot in the entire building, on the wall of his personal study, directly behind his massive wooden desk. For the next 7 years, that seal would hang there. It witnessed the end of World War II. It witnessed the descent of the Iron Curtain. It witnessed the Korean War. It hung inches above the head of 4 successive U.S. ambassadors: Averell Harriman, Walter Bedell Smith, Alan Kirk, and George Kennan. Every secret conversation, every dictated cable to the president, every strategy meeting about the containment of communism happened within the acoustic shadow of the eagle's beak. The Americans thought they were secure. They had swept the room hundreds of times. They had torn up the floorboards, checked the phone lines, X-rayed the walls. They found nothing. They couldn't find the bug because they were looking for technology they understood, and they were up against a device that shouldn't have existed. The architect of this impossible machine was not a faceless Soviet bureaucrat. He was a man whose name was synonymous with music, a tragic genius who had been swallowed by the Gulag system. Lev Sergeyevich Theremin, known to the West as Leon Theremin. In the 1920s, Theremin had been the toast of New York City. He was the inventor of the theremin, the electronic instrument played without touch, whose eerie, wavering sound would later define the soundtracks of science fiction movies. He was a celebrity, a physicist, and a musician who moved in high society. But in 1938, under mysterious circumstances, Theremin returned to the Soviet Union. He was immediately arrested during Stalin's Great Purge, accused of anti-Soviet propaganda, and sentenced to the Gulag. But Stalin didn't waste genius. Theremin was pulled from the brutal labor camps of Kolyma and placed in a sharashka, a secret research and development laboratory within the prison system. Here, the Soviet Union's brightest minds, imprisoned and stripped of their rights, were forced to invent weapons for the state that enslaved them. They were given better food than the other prisoners, warm clothes, and laboratory equipment, but they were still slaves. Their survival depended entirely on their ability to produce results. It was in this high-pressure cooker of intellect and fear that Lavrenti Beria, the head of the NKVD, brought Theremin a challenge. The problem was simple. The American embassy was becoming a fortress. They were finding every microphone the NKVD planted. The batteries died too quickly. The wires were too easy to find. Beria demanded a microphone that could listen forever, that had no power source to detect, and that was small enough to be invisible. He was asking for magic. Theremin, drawing on his deep understanding of radio physics and resonance, the same principles that made his musical instrument, work conceived of a device that was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its effectiveness. He called it the Thing, or in Russian, Slatoust, meaning golden mouth. The device Theremin built was a passive cavity resonator. It was a technological paradox. It consisted of 3 parts: a small copper cylinder, the cavity, a tiny flexible membrane, the diaphragm, over one end, and a simple antenna protruding from the side. That was it. No vacuum tubes, no transistors, no batteries. Left alone, the device was completely inert. It was dead metal. An American technician sweeping the room with a radio frequency detector would hear absolutely nothing because the device was transmitting nothing. It was effectively a piece of debris. But the genius lay in how it was activated. The device was tuned to a very specific radio frequency. To turn it on, KVD technicians sitting in a van or a safe house hundreds of yards away would aim a powerful radio beam at the Spaso house. This beam, called the illuminator, would pass through the walls of the embassy and hit the antenna of the device inside the seal. The energy from the incoming radio beam was enough to wake up the resonant cavity. When people in the room spoke, the sound waves of their voices would hit the thin membrane on the front of the cylinder. The membrane would vibrate. These vibrations would slightly alter the shape of the cavity, which in turn modulated the radio signal that was bouncing back to the Soviet receivers. It was, in essence, a radio mirror. The Soviets shone a light on it, and the bug reflected that light back, carrying the audio of the room encoded in the reflection. As long as the Soviets kept their external generator running, the bug would work. It could work for 10 years, 100 years, 1,000 years. It could not die, because it was never really alive. Theremin's design was so sensitive that the membrane had to be incredibly thin, yet durable enough to withstand the acoustic pressure. He didn't just build a microphone. He built a new category of surveillance technology. But a bug is useless if it's buried inside a thick block of wood that muffles the sound. This is where the artistry of the woodcarvers at the Artec camp became part of the weapon system. The Great Seal wasn't just a container. It was an acoustic lens. The NKVD carpenters, working under Theremin's instructions, had drilled tiny, almost microscopic holes under the beak of the eagle, creating a pathway for sound waves to reach the device hidden in the hollowed-out center. The type of wood chosen, Persian walnut, was hard and resonant, acting almost like the body of a violin, amplifying the speech frequencies in the room. When Harriman hung the seal behind his desk, he placed the microphone in the perfect acoustic sweet spot of the room. When he leaned back in his chair to discuss the Marshall Plan or the Berlin blockade, he was speaking directly into the ear of Lavrentiy Beria. For 7 years, the golden mouth operated with impunity. The take was enormous. The Soviets knew the American negotiating positions before the meeting started. They knew the personal weaknesses of the diplomatic staff. They knew about the internal rifts between Washington and the embassy. It is impossible to calculate the strategic damage caused by the device because it informed the subtlety of Soviet diplomacy for nearly a decade. They didn't have to guess what the Americans were thinking. They could hear them thinking. The discovery of the device, when it finally happened in 1952, was largely an accident of physics and paranoia. The Americans had begun to suspect that the Spaso house was compromised, not because they found a bug, but because the leaked information was too precise. The State Department sent their best security officers, equipped with the latest wideband monitoring equipment, to Moscow, but they were still looking for active signals. It was a British radio operator at the UK embassy, some distance away, who first caught a ghost signal. He was monitoring Soviet military air traffic when he heard a voice that sounded American. He tuned in. It was the voice of the British air attaché, coming from inside the American ambassador's study. The signal was weak, drifting, and then it vanished. The British tipped off the Americans. Someone is broadcasting your room, but only sometimes. This clue changed the hunt. The American technicians realized the signal wasn't constant. It appeared and disappeared. This led them to the theory of a passive device. In September 1952, George Kennan, the architect of the containment policy, was the new ambassador. He had a suspicion. He ordered a saturating sweep. Technicians set up a signal generator of their own and began blasting the ambassador's study with every frequency imaginable, while another team with receivers hunted for a reflection. Kennan, playing his part in the trap, sat at his desk and began to dictate a dispatch from a dummy diplomatic cable, reading aloud about the economic conditions in the Urals. The technicians ramped up the power. Suddenly, on a receiver tuned to 1800 megahertz, a technician heard Kennan's voice come through crystal clear. They had found the frequency. Now they had to find the source. They moved around the room with a handheld directional antenna. The signal got stronger near the window, stronger near the desk. Finally, the technician stood directly in front of the Great Seal. The headphones screamed with feedback. Kennan stopped reading. The room went silent. The technician pointed a trembling finger at the symbol of American power hanging on the wall. They took the seal down. It was heavy, solid. There were no screws, no latches. It was a seamless piece of art. They carried it to a secure room, and with heavy hearts began to destroy it. They used a chisel to split the wood along the seam of the eagle's perimeter. As the two halves of the seal came apart, the Americans stared in disbelief. There was no battery, no tangle of wires, just a small silver can the size of a quarter, resting in a resonant chamber with a small wire antenna curling out like a worm. Ambassador Kennan later wrote that his first reaction was one of grudging admiration. It was unfathomably simple, he recalled. A child could understand it, but only a genius could have invented it. The Americans had spent millions on vacuum tubes and encryption. The Soviets had beaten them with a tin can and a radio beam. But the discovery was just the beginning of the mystery. The device was flown immediately to Washington, to the laboratories of the FBI and the Naval Research Laboratory. The best engineers in America stared at it. They hooked it up to oscilloscopes. They X-rayed it. And for a long time, they couldn't figure out how to make it work. It was so simple, it was confusing. The membrane was incredibly delicate, damaged during the extraction. The Americans had to reverse engineer the physics of the endovibrator to understand what they were dealing with. The realization hit the U.S. intelligence community like a sledgehammer. If the Soviets could build this, what else did they have? The thing forced a complete redesign of American countermeasures. It birthed the field of non-linear junction detection, a science of finding passive electronics. But in 1952, the U.S. government made a strategic choice. They didn't go public. They didn't scream at the UN. They kept the device a secret. Why? Because they wanted to copy it. The CIA realized that Theremin's invention was perfect. If they could replicate it, they could use it against the Soviets. For 8 years, the Great Seal bug sat in a classified vault at the CIA, studied, analyzed, and cloned. It was a card kept up the sleeve, waiting for the right moment to be played. That moment came in May 1960. The U-2 incident had backed the U.S. into a corner. They needed a prop. They needed something to show the world that espionage was a two-way street, and that the Soviets were just as guilty of violating sovereignty as the Americans. And so, the wooden eagle was dusted off. The listener was reinstalled for demonstration, and Henry Cabot Lodge, Jr. carried it into the Security Council to perform the final act of Leon Theremin's play. But the story of the Great Seal bug is more than just a tale of clever engineering. It is a window into the soul of the Soviet system. While the device was hanging in Spaso House, its inventor, Leon Theremin, was still a prisoner. He had given the state a weapon of incalculable value, and his reward was ... continued imprisonment. He wasn't released until 1947, and even then, he was encouraged to continue working for the KGB. He would spend decades in obscurity, the world believing he was dead, while his musical instruments played on soundtracks in Hollywood, and his listening devices stole secrets in Moscow. Therimin's life was the ultimate irony. He was a man who dedicated his early life to creating music out of thin air, using the ether to bring beauty into the world. He ended his life having used those same principles to pull secrets out of the air, turning the physics of resonance into a tool of oppression. The Thing was his masterpiece, a perfect convergence of art and espionage. It was beautiful, invisible, and terrifyingly effective. The legacy of the Great Seal Bug endures today. Every time you walk into a secure facility and are asked to leave your cell phone outside, every time a room is swept for anomalies, the ghost of the Spaso House Eagle is present. It taught the world that you don't need to be complex to be dangerous. You just need to be clever. And it taught diplomats a lesson that they still whisper to rookies on their first posting. Beware of Greeks bearing gifts, but be even more terrified of Soviets bearing wood carvings. The psychological impact on the U.S. State Department was profound. The Spaso House, once seen as a sanctuary, was revealed to be a fishbowl. The paranoia that gripped the embassy staff in the years following the discovery was debilitating. Diplomatic cables from the era described staff writing notes to each other on pads of paper rather than speaking, or holding meetings in the center of the garden in the Russian winter, shivering in the snow because the garden was the only place they could be sure the walls weren't listening. The Thing also triggered a technological arms race in the world of surveillance. The Americans developed the Satyr program to replicate the technology. They realized that if a passive bug could be hidden in a seal, it could be hidden anywhere, in a brick, in a shoe heel, in a tooth. The definition of secure had to be rewritten. The idea that a room was safe just because it was electrically silent was dead. The age of passive surveillance had begun. In the end, the most haunting image of this entire saga is not the device itself, but the image of Ambassador Harriman in 1945, standing in the Arctic camp, surrounded by smiling children, holding the wooden eagle. He looks genuinely happy. He looks like a man who believes that the war is over and that peace is possible. He has no idea that he is holding his own betrayal in his hands. It is a perfect snapshot of the start of the Cold War, a handshake with one hand and a microphone with the other. The Great Seal was the ultimate symbol of the era, a beautiful, hollow facade, hiding a listening ear that never slept, never ate, and never missed a word. This story forces us to look at the objects around us differently. In our modern age of smart devices, Alexa, and Siri, we have voluntarily filled our homes with listening devices. We have invited the Thing into our living rooms, not tricked by a wooden eagle, but seduced by convenience. Leon Theremin would have marveled at it. He had to build a device that worked by magic to get into the ambassador's study. We simply buy them and plug them in. The technology has changed, the players have changed, but the fundamental truth remains. If you are speaking, someone, somewhere, has the capacity to listen. And usually, the listener is hiding in the object you least suspect. The discovery of the Great Seal Bug in September 1952 did not lead to a public outcry or a diplomatic explosion, but rather to a terrifying silence that settled over the American intelligence community. The United States government made a calculated, strategic decision to keep the discovery absolute secret, not just from the public, but from the Soviets themselves. The logic was cold and pragmatic. If they screamed in outrage, the KGB would know their masterpiece had been found and would simply invent something new, something perhaps even harder to detect. Instead, the Americans wanted to study the ghost machine. The wooden eagle was removed from the wall of Spaso House under the cover of darkness, packed in a diplomatic pouch, and flown to Washington, D.C., where it was delivered to the deepest recesses of the FBI and the Naval Research Laboratory. There, the best engineers in the Western world stared at the device in confusion, because on first inspection, it appeared to be broken, or perhaps not a machine at all. The reverse engineering process was a humiliating lesson in Soviet theoretical superiority. American technicians were accustomed to vacuum tubes, heavy batteries, and complex wiring diagrams, but they were looking at a device that had none of these things. It took months for the physicists to fully grasp the elegance of Leon Theremin's design. They realized that the thing was a passive cavity resonator that acted as an audio mirror, but the real shock came when they understood the power source. The bug didn't have a battery because the battery was external. The Soviets were flooding the American embassy with a high-powered radio beam from a listening post across the street, a continuous stream of microwave energy that bathed the building in radiation. This beam, later classified as the Moscow signal, passed through the brick and mortar of the embassy, struck the antennae of the bug, and reanimated the device. The implications were nauseating for the State Department security officers. It meant that for 7 years, every man, woman, and child living and working in the ambassador's residence had been living inside a low-intensity microwave oven, unwitting subjects in a massive, continuous radiation experiment designed solely to steal secrets. This realization triggered a secret arms race that would define the technical side of the Cold War for the next decade. The CIA launched a covert program with the codename Satyr to replicate the technology, realizing that if the Soviets could turn a block of wood into a microphone, the Americans needed to be able to do the same. For years, British and American scientists struggled to manufacture the delicate metallic membrane that was the heart of the device, often failing to match the sensitivity that Theremin had achieved with handmade tools in a prison laboratory. While the scientists labored in secret, the diplomats in Moscow were forced to live in a state of paranoid theater. Since they couldn't stop the microwave beams without encasing the entire embassy in a lead Faraday cage, they had to adapt their behavior. Ambassadors began writing sensitive notes on magic slates, children's toys that could be erased by lifting a plastic sheet rather than speaking aloud. Critical meetings were moved to the center of the embassy courtyard, where diplomats would pace back and forth in the snow, knowing that the outdoor acoustics made the resonant cavity useless. The symbol of American power in Moscow had been reduced to a silent movie where the actors were afraid to speak their lines. The secret of the Great Seal was kept for 8 long years, a card tucked up the sleeve of the Eisenhower administration, waiting for the perfect moment to be played. That moment arrived with the violence of a car crash in May 1960. The catalyst was the U-2 incident, a disaster that brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. When the Soviets shot down Francis Gary Powers and put the wreckage of his spy plane on display in Gorky Park, they trapped the United States in a devastating lie. President Eisenhower had initially claimed the U-2 was a weather plane that had drifted off course, but Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev had waited, holding the captured pilot in reserve, before revealing the truth and exposing the president as a liar on the global stage. The moral high ground that America had claimed since World War II evaporated overnight. The Soviets were jubilant, painting the United States as a warmongering aggressor that trampled on international law and violated the sovereignty of nations with its spy planes. The United Nations Security Council convened in New York in an atmosphere of suffocating tension to debate the Soviet resolution, condemning American aggression. The Soviet Foreign Minister, Andrei Gromyko, delivered a blistering attack, portraying the USSR as the innocent victim of American espionage. It was a propaganda slaughter, and the American delegation, led by Ambassador Henry Cabot Lodge, Jr., appeared cornered. But Lodge had brought the Wooden Eagle to New York. The decision to declassify the Great Seal was a desperate gamble, a tactical counterpunch designed to prove that in the dirty game of the Cold War, there were no innocents. On May 26, 1960, the theater of the UN reached its climax. As Gromyko finished his denunciation of the U-2, Lodge asked for the floor. He didn't offer an apology. Instead, he signaled to his aides, who brought forward the massive, carved seal. placing it on a table in the center of the horseshoe-shaped chamber. With the cameras of the world zooming in, Lodge performed a forensic autopsy on live television. He used a pair of tweezers to point out the tiny holes in the eagle's beak, barely visible to the naked eye, and then split the seal open to reveal the metallic cylinder hiding in the heart of the wood. The room erupted in gasps. Lodge's voice cut through the noise as he explained exactly what the object was. He detailed how it had hung over the head of the American ambassador for years, how it had been a gift of friendship from Soviet children, and how it represented a violation of sovereignty far more intimate and prolonged than a single plane flight. "This is a listening mechanism," Lodge declared, holding the silver cylinder up to the light. It was right behind the ambassador's desk. The visual was devastatingly effective. The U-2 was a distant, abstract machine that had crashed in the Ural Mountains. But the Great Seal was a betrayal of hospitality, a Trojan horse that struck a chord with every diplomat in the room who feared for the sanctity of their own embassies. The Soviet delegation sat stone-faced, caught in their own hypocrisy. Lodge argued that while the U-2 was a necessary measure to protect against surprise attack in a closed society, the Great Seal was evidence of the relentless, pervasive nature of Soviet espionage that made such measures necessary. The reveal didn't save the U-2 program, nor did it free Francis Gary Powers, but it achieved a crucial stalemate in the court of public opinion. It muddied the waters, proving that while the Americans watched from the sky, the Soviets listened from the walls. The thing had transitioned from an intelligence disaster to a propaganda weapon, neutralizing the Soviet moral offensive by showing that the game of spies was played in the mud by both sides. But beyond the political theater, the public revelation of the Great Seal bug changed the psychological landscape of the Cold War forever. It introduced the world to the concept of the bugged society. Before 1960, the idea of electronic surveillance was the stuff of science fiction or detective novels. After Lodge's demonstration, it became a terrifying reality for anyone in power. Corporate executives, politicians, and foreign leaders began tearing apart their offices, looking for their own wooden eagles. The term "the thing" entered the lexicon of counterintelligence as the gold standard of threats. It forced a complete redesign of secure facilities. Architects began designing rooms within rooms, floating boxes isolated from the structural walls to prevent vibration. The era of trusting a locked door was over. Yet, amidst the diplomatic shouting match, the tragedy of the device's inventor remained buried. Leon Theremin watched the UN proceedings from the shadows of Moscow, seeing his masterpiece paraded on television not as a triumph of science, but as a symbol of deceit. The instrument he had created to be the ultimate invisible ear was now the most famous spy device in history. The Great Seal bug was eventually retired to the CIA Museum, and later displayed at the National Cryptologic Museum, where it sits today behind glass. It looks innocuous, like a piece of rusted plumbing, but it remains a monument to a specific moment in history when the desire to know the enemy's secrets became so intense that it bent the laws of physics. The legacy of the Hollow Eagle is not just in the history books. It is in every sweep for electronic devices, every shielded room, and every whisper in a hallway that continues to this day. The Soviets had proven that with enough ingenuity, even a block of wood could be made to betray a nation. And that once trust is drilled out and replaced with a microphone, it can never be truly patched again. While the wooden eagle sat in a museum case in Washington, treated as a relic of a closed chapter, the invisible force that had powered it continued to assault the American embassy in Moscow with relentless intensity. The removal of the Great Seal in 1952 had destroyed the microphone, but it had not stopped the beam. American security technicians, monitoring the electromagnetic spectrum around Spaso House and the main Chancery building, discovered a terrifying anomaly that persisted long after the bug was gone. The Soviets were still flooding the embassy with low-intensity microwave radiation. This phenomenon, which became known in classified circles as the Moscow Signal, transformed the diplomatic mission from a site of espionage into the ground zero of a bizarre and terrifying medical mystery that would span 3 decades. The persistence of the beam baffled American intelligence. If the listening device was gone, why were the Soviets still pumping gigahertz of energy into the building? Theories ranged from the pragmatic to the paranoid. Some analysts believed the Soviets were activating other, undiscovered passive bugs hidden deep in the structural concrete. Others feared they were jamming American electronic intelligence. But a darker faction within the CIA and the Pentagon began to suspect that the beam itself was the weapon. This suspicion birthed one of the most secretive and ethically dubious programs of the Cold War, Project Pandora, launched in 1965 by the Advanced Research Projects Agency, ARPA. The program was an attempt to determine if the Soviets were using microwave radiation to alter the behavior or damage the biology of American diplomats. The fear was that the Moscow Signal was a mind control weapon or a slow-kill ray designed to induce confusion, lethargy, or cancer in the embassy staff. In secret laboratories in the United States, monkeys were subjected to the same frequencies and intensities found in the Moscow embassy to see if they would lose the ability to perform tasks or if their blood chemistry would change. The results were inconclusive and often contradictory, fueling a bureaucratic panic. The State Department found itself trapped in a moral vice. If they told the embassy staff they were being irradiated, they risked a mass resignation and a diplomatic rupture with the USSR. If they said nothing, they were treating their own people as laboratory rats in a Soviet experiment. They chose silence. For over a decade, ambassadors and clerks lived, slept, and worked in a microwave bath, unaware that their headaches and fatigue might be the result of a deliberate electromagnetic siege. The human cost of this silence appeared to be devastating. A grim pattern emerged among the men who held the top post in Moscow. Ambassador Walter Bedell Smith, who had unknowingly hung the Great Seal on his wall, died of a heart attack shortly after leaving his post. Ambassador Charles Bolin developed serious illness. Ambassador Llewellyn Thompson died of cancer. Ambassador Foy Kohler suffered from eye hemorrhages. The most tragic case was that of Ambassador Walter Stoessel, who served in the 1970s and eventually died of leukemia. Stoessel, a man of immense discipline, began suffering from a rare blood disorder and bleeding from the eyes while in Moscow. He was one of the few who suspected the truth. In a confidential memo that was later declassified, Stoessel famously told his staff that he felt like a guinea pig. The list of symptoms reported by embassy staff: nausea, dizziness, blood anomalies, and a pervasive mental fog became known as the microwave syndrome, while epidemiological studies conducted years later by Johns Hopkins University would officially claim there was no statistically significant link between the signal and the cancer rates. The staff on the ground felt they were being slowly poisoned by an enemy they couldn't see. The crisis reached a breaking point in the mid-1970s, when the existence of the Moscow Signal was finally leaked to the press. The reaction was a firestorm of outrage. The State Department was forced to install massive aluminum screens over the windows of the embassy to deflect the microwave energy, giving the building the appearance of a prison or a birdcage. Diplomatic relations froze as the U.S. formally protested the bombardment. The Soviets, with characteristic denial, claimed the radiation was merely industrial noise from nearby factories or part of their own jamming systems. But the timing and focus of the beams on the upper floors of the Chancery suggested a sniper's aim. The Great Seal had been the Trojan horse that introduced the threat, but the radiation was the army that stayed behind to burn the city. It forced the United States to completely rethink the architecture of diplomacy. The new embassy in Moscow would eventually be built as a fortress within a fortress, designed to be impervious to the electromagnetic spectrum, a testament to the fact that the air itself had become hostile territory. While the Americans were fighting ghosts in the ether, The architect of the technology, Leon Theremin, was living a ghost life of his own. After his rehabilitation from the Gulag, the Soviet state refused to let him go. The genius who had given them the Great Seal was too valuable to be free. For decades, Theremin worked in a closed KGB laboratory, designing listening devices that were ever more sophisticated. He developed systems to pick up conversations by bouncing infrared beams off glass windows, detecting the minute vibrations of the pain caused by human speech inside the precursor, to the laser microphones used by modern spies. He lived in a state of suspended animation, a man out of time. To the West, he was the dead inventor of a quirky musical instrument. To the KGB, he was comrade innovator. It was a cruel paradox. The man who wanted to create the music of the ether was forced to fill the ether with the noise of espionage. It was not until the late 1960s that the silence around Theremin was broken, and it happened by pure chance. A New York Times reporter, Harold Schoenberg, was visiting the Moscow Conservatory and bumped into an old man with bright, intelligent eyes who was discussing acoustics. When the man introduced himself as Professor Theremin, the reporter was stunned. The news that Theremin was alive rippled through the international music community, leading to a brief window where he was allowed to correspond with Western colleagues. But the KGB, fearing he would reveal the secrets of the Great Seal and other devices, quickly clamped down again. They destroyed his instruments, fired him from his post at the conservatory, and erased him from the public record once more. "Electricity is not for music," a party official reportedly told him as they smashed his laboratory. "Electricity is for execution." Theremin spent the next 20 years working as a lowly mechanic in a university physics department, tuning equipment for students who had no idea they were speaking to the Da Vinci of electronic espionage. The final act of Theremin's life coincided with the collapse of the empire he had served. In 1991, as the Soviet Union disintegrated, an American filmmaker finally managed to bring the 95-year-old inventor back to New York. It was a surreal homecoming. The man who had revolutionized spying walked the streets of Manhattan, marveling at the synthesizers and electronic music that were the great-grandchildren of his invention. But the shadow of the Great Seal never left him. In interviews before his death in 1993, Theremin expressed a profound melancholic ambivalence. He was proud of the elegance of the thing as a physicist. He knew it was a perfect machine, but he mourned the fact that his intellect had been weaponized. He had wanted to help humanity hear new sounds, but he had been forced to help the state hear secret whispers. His life was the ultimate cautionary tale of science. Under totalitarianism, genius does not grant freedom. It only increases the value of the prisoner. The technological legacy of the Great Seal bug is woven into the fabric of modern surveillance. The principle of passive backscatter, illuminating a dormant tag with radio waves to read its data, is the foundational technology of the RFID chips in our passports, credit cards, and inventory trackers. Every time you tap a card to pay for a coffee, you are using a benign descendant of the device that hung in Spaso House. But the darker legacy remains as well. The Great Seal proved that anything can be a listening device. It destroyed the concept of privacy in physical spaces. Today, with the proliferation of smart devices, accelerometers in phones that can detect sound vibrations, and malware that turns cameras into spies, we have entered an era where the entire world is the Great Seal. We have voluntarily placed the thing in our pockets, our bedrooms, and our boardrooms. The wooden eagle was just the prototype. The finished product is the modern digital world. As we look back at the Cold War, the Great Seal stands as a monument to the terrifying creativity of conflict. It was a weapon made of wood and air, a symbol of friendship that was actually an act of aggression. It remains the most successful listening device in history, not because of how many secrets it stole, but because of how long it lasted. It hung in plain sight, admired by its victims, dusted by the embassy cleaning staff, and saluted by the Marines. It defied the technological arrogance of the United States, proving that in the game of intelligence, complexity is often a liability, and the most dangerous object in the room is the one that looks the most innocent. The eagle on the wall never blinked, never slept, and thanks to Leon Theremin, it never died. It just waited for the beam to turn on and for the Americans to start talking. The discovery of the Great Seal was supposed to be the vaccination that immunized the United States against Soviet electronic infiltration. But history would prove it was merely the first symptom of a chronic disease. While the wooden eagle sat gathering dust in a museum, the methodology it pioneered, the modification of everyday objects into passive spies, evolved into a terrifying art form that haunted the Cold War until its final days. The lesson the KGB learned from Leon Theremin was not that they had been caught, but that they had been caught because they used a single, distinct object. The next generation of surveillance would not rely on a gift hung on a wall, but on the tools of bureaucracy itself. In the mid-1970s, as the paranoia over the Moscow signal radiation was at its peak, the Soviet intelligence services executed an operation so audacious and technically brilliant that it made the Great Seal look like a child's toy. This operation, later discovered by the NSA under the codename Project Gunman, proved that the spirit of the Great Seal had infected the very machinery of American diplomacy. For years, the gold standard of office equipment in American embassies worldwide was the IBM Selectric typewriter. It was a masterpiece of electromechanical engineering, known for its distinctive golf ball type element that spun and struck the paper with satisfying precision. It was loud, robust, and considered completely secure because it was purely mechanical. It had no circuits to hack, no software to corrupt. The Soviets saw this confidence as an opportunity. In a logistical feat that rivals the construction of the Great Seal, KGB technical teams managed to intercept shipments of these typewriters destined for the U.S. Embassy in Moscow and the consulate in Leningrad. They didn't steal them. They modified them. Working with the precision of watchmakers, they installed a microscopic bug inside the metal bar that ran across the bottom of the machine. This device, a marvel of miniaturization, sensed the unique magnetic signature of each key press. It didn't record sound. It recorded the movement of the mechanics. Like the Great Seal, the typewriter bug was a passive ghost. It lay dormant, buried deep inside the chassis of the machine, invisible to X-rays because it looked exactly like the surrounding metal components. It was powered by a burst of energy, similar to the Moscow signal, and it would transmit its data in short, compressed bursts to listening posts nearby. For 8 years, from 1976 to 1984, the Soviets read every classified memo, every cable to the president, and every identity of every CIA asset in the Soviet Union, not by cracking codes, but by capturing the keystrokes before they were even put on paper. The discovery of the gunman bug required the NSA to dismantle the typewriters down to the molecular level. When they finally found the anomaly, a coil of wire no thicker than a human hair, it sparked a crisis that echoed the Great Seal disaster. The Americans realized once again that their enemy was not just listening to the room, but was embedded in the tools they used to think. This relentless assault on physical security culminated in the 1980s with the construction of the new office building, NOB, for the U.S. Embassy in Moscow. It was intended to be a state-of-the-art fortress, a symbol of American resolve, designed to be impervious to the kind of attacks that had compromised Spaso House. The U.S. government spent hundreds of millions of dollars and imported American contractors to supervise the work. But they were building on Soviet soil, using Soviet concrete and Soviet steel. In a repeat of the Arctic camp strategy, the KGB turned the construction site into a massive Trojan horse. But this time, they didn't hide a bug in a gift. They made the building itself the bug. When American security teams swept the partially completed structure in 1985, they found that the concrete columns were honeycombed with a complex network of wiring that served no structural purpose. The rebar had been welded into specific antenna shapes. The steel beams were magnetized to act as microphones. The new embassy was a structural catastrophe. The Soviets had integrated the surveillance system into the skeleton of the building. There was no way to remove the bugs without destroying the building. The listening devices were part of the load-bearing walls. The embarrassment was total. The United States had to halt construction, leaving the half-finished embassy standing as a hollow monument to intelligence failure for years. Eventually, they were forced to tear down the top floors and rebuild them using completely sanitized materials shipped from the U.S. Underarmed Guard, creating a top hat of secure space on top of a compromised skyscraper. The ghost of the Great Seal was laughing from the foundations. The Soviets had proven that as long as they controlled the physical environment, they owned the conversation. The psychological toll of this endless game of cat and mouse fundamentally changed the character of American diplomacy. The concept of home was erased for diplomats serving behind the Iron Curtain. They lived in a panopticon where privacy was a luxury they could no longer afford. The State Department developed the goldfish bowl policy, assuming that everything said inside the embassy was known to the KGB. This led to a strange, bifurcated existence where diplomats lived two lives: the performative life they lived for the microphones, speaking in platitudes and disinformation, and the real life they lived in scribble pads and hushed whispers in the secure. Bubble Room's transparent plastic boxes suspended in the middle of a room to prevent vibration transfer. The Great Seal had taught them that trust was a fatal weakness. The legacy of the device was a permanent, institutionalized paranoia that stripped the human warmth out of diplomatic relations and replaced it with a sterile, defensive crouch. As the Cold War wound down and the Soviet Union collapsed, the archives of the KGB opened briefly, offering a glimpse into the mirror world. The files revealed that the Great Seal was just the tip of the iceberg. There were plans for bugs in radiators, in flower pots, in the shoes of ambassadors, and in the collars of family dogs. The ingenuity of the Soviet technical directorates was boundless because it was driven by a totalitarian necessity, the need to know everything. But the files also revealed a strange respect for their American counterparts. The KGB technicians admired the eventual American countermeasures. It was a technical brotherhood, a deadly game played by engineers on both sides, who understood the physics of silence better than anyone else on Earth. In the final analysis, the story of the Great Seal is the story of the loss of innocence in the technological age. Before 1945, there was a belief that walls provided sanctuary. After 1945, and specifically after the hanging of the wooden eagle, that belief was obsolete. The device bridged the gap between the physical and the ethereal, turning a solid object into a portal for information. It prefigured the world we live in today, where the distinction between offline and online has vanished. The Great Seal was the grandfather of the smart speaker, the connected thermostat, and the location tracker. It demonstrated that utility and convenience, the beauty of the carving, the prestige of the gift, are the most effective camouflage for surveillance. Today, the Great Seal rests in the National Cryptologic Museum, usually surrounded by a quiet group of visitors who lean in to see the tiny holes in the beak. It is a dead object now, stripped of its membrane and its antenna, innocuous and silent. But for those who know its history, it still hums with a latent power. It is a physical reminder that the most dangerous weapon of the 20th century was not the nuclear bomb, which was never used, but the microphone, which was used every day. It shifted the power dynamic of the world, not by destroying cities, but by stealing the thoughts of the men who ruled them. The thing was the ultimate expression of the Cold War's central thesis, that there is no such thing as a private moment in a world divided by ideology. The eagle on the wall watched the peace treaties and the proxy wars, the birthday parties and the strategy sessions. indifferent to the history passing beneath its wings. It was the perfect spy patient, invisible, and hollow in its hollowness. It held the terrifying truth of the modern age. We are never truly alone.